I'll remember that. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Technical Advisory Committee. Today is Wednesday, October 20th, 2021. And we have a full quorum for our committee. And first order of business is the summary notes from our last meeting of September 29th. We have a motion to approve the meeting notes, or do we have comments thereof? A motion to approve. Okay. Motion, do we have a second? Seconded. Anybody opposed, say nay. All in favor are good. And we'll move on to the approval of the goals, objectives, and performance measures for transaction update. I assume that's the approval is coming up after Mr. Shree gives us a presentation.
Well, more like Dahlia get to say what she has. Well, but yes, I just want it does say, so you can go to the presentation actually.
That's right.
I don't want to do the thing my name is next to, so maybe we won't be.
That's right. Don't make too hard.
That's not how it works, though. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm gonna laugh.
So, yeah, thank you, Chair, boys and members. So, several people asked, what exactly are we doing today in terms of taking the action?
We always ask
just
that.
the measures, or is it the rates? Let me say upfront, it is just the goals, objectives, and measures. We are not taking any action on waste today. That will be the next week. So we discussed this process and what is happening in different months several times in the past. But we are in the second last bullet here at the October cycle of committee meetings. We have discussed about the goals, objectives, and measures several in the last 2 or 3 committee meetings. And we took all your feedback from other committees, and we incorporated all that into those set of goals, objectives, and measures. And today we are bringing it back to you. You can take a final look at it and see if you're happy with it. Then you can what the staff is recommending. If you're happy with that, you can recommend that for approval by the authority. If you still need to change things, you are welcome to do that. That's what it's all for. So we want to get your opinion. So you can make changes if you feel like as a committee, and we will take that to the authority as tax recommendation at their November meeting. So by then, the other committees will also take similar actions. All those recommendations, it may or may not be the same as staff recommendation. We will take all that to the authority, so authority can see who said what and then take an informed decision at that point. So the discussion here, Daria will take you through is the rest of the feedback we got from you all and from other committees after what we heard from last time, and then how we incorporated that, and we cleaned up the whole table of goals of these measures, and then we presented to you for discussion and then take an action. Sorry.
Okay. I've been told I'm very quiet when I'm in a mask, so I'm going to try and fix that. Okay, so the first thing is not new, but it's some new framing. And we've, over the course of the last several months, as we've had a lot of these conversations, we've heard some confusion about the difference between the goals and the core values. And so we wanted to try and share this concept, this framing with you guys to help separate those a little bit and see how we're tying them together. So the idea that we've come up with here is that the goals are what we're trying to achieve, right? And we've got those 3 goals that we've been talking about for a couple of months now of enhancing mobility, increasing accessibility, and improving resilience. But we found that a lot of people are also thinking that our core values are our goals, what we're trying to achieve. So what we're trying to say is the goals are what we're trying to achieve, and the core values are how we want to achieve. So thinking about it, there are many ways you can enhance mobility. We want to do it safely, we want to do it equitably, and we want to do it And so that's the framing we're trying to help people think about these through, and why those two are not identical, why the core values are not goals in of themselves. Questions, thoughts? Does that make sense to people? Okay. Our next slide, we have talked about these a lot, but our objectives, just to remind everybody, are measurable targeted actions that result in incremental, tangible advancement towards goals. Our performance measures will be used to evaluate the impacts of policies, programs, projects, and scenarios affecting the transportation system, and will be used to measure progress towards goals and objectives. Each performance measure can be weighted differently. So as Stu was talking about, next month we will talk extensively about what those weights should be. And those can be changed to reflect the region's priorities. We have set up sort of with you guys some goals for our performance measures. So we want to make sure that they're incorporating all the project types, all the different modes. We want to make sure that they're reflecting those core values. We want to restrict the number of them so that we can focus strongly on the region's core principles. We want to make sure that they can be calculated easily and well, and that they can be measured consistently. So they, for the most part, they're quantifiable things that we want to measure consistently using the tools that we have. And we want them to be relatively easy to communicate to the public and for the public to understand. So to improve our transparency as much as we possibly can with the public. So if nobody has any questions or concerns there, I'll just go over what we've heard since we were here last and what changes have been made to, I think at this point, it's just the measures that have changed. I think our goals and objectives have settled down and haven't had any changes made to them. But I could be proven wrong by my own presentation in a few minutes, so we'll find out. So some of the things that we heard that we've made changes based on. So there was a request, several requests actually, to add a method of analyzing non-motorized projects or aspects of projects under the mobility goal. And so what we've done and what we've incorporated is under that first objective, and the measure that goes with it is about reducing delay. We're making sure that any reductions in congestion caused by pedestrian or bike projects are being accounted for in those measures. So even though delay is a measure for cars, if a pedestrian project or a bike project is encouraging more biking or walking and therefore taking people out of cars, it will reduce congestion, and we will be accounting for that in those measures. The same would be true of the reliability measure for cars. So that's what's been done there. There was a request, and we talked about this a little bit, of moving the emissions reduction objective from mobility to resiliency. So we have moved it under the resiliency goal. So it's just moved its location. It doesn't actually change terribly much, but nobody's been real comfortable with it where it was. So we thought that that made sense. There was a request in to add a bike accessibility measure or an element of bike accessibility to our one of our accessibility metrics, which is improving access to jobs. And so as it was previously, we were looking at access to jobs by auto and transit. And we are now adding access to jobs by bike as well. So it will account for all three of those now. The next one was related to the emissions performance metric. We had been showing it as being very related to BMT. That was causing some trouble, I think, for some of the less technical folks. So we've changed the description of that performance measure to be that it will be an estimate of emissions, but those emissions are still estimated based on BMT at various speeds. That's the way that math works out. At different levels of speed and congestion. There was a request to include pedestrian and bike modes in the safety measure. That was already a part of the safety measure, so hadn't taken any action, but we agreed that should be included. And there was a request to include a measure of network redundancy under the resiliency goal. And so this one was a little bit complicated. So we have updated the performance measure for objective G to represent network redundancy. And I will say this is actually a little bit inaccurate based on the conclusion we came to at the end of last week. The notion was, the request had been made primarily to see if there was a good transit alternative to driving. That had been the request that was made. And that the request was made to use that to replace the measure that looked at the 10% surge, the Homeland Security evacuation measure. And while I think everybody understood the desire to do that, we went back and looked at the enabling legislation and found that we couldn't make the case for doing that based on the way that's written. It requires looking at redundancy and the ability to deal with excess capacity in the network, unfortunately. So we couldn't find a way to do that, and we do have to sort of stick with that measure because of that. But we are phrasing it a little bit differently to help folks understand why we would be doing that measure instead of focusing just on the Homeland Security evacuation, which is no longer everybody's top priority. There are a couple other comments that we got that were not incorporated into the measures. So the first one is including a method for supporting supporting investment in RACs. RACs are regional activity centers and are defined by COG. So in the previous version of transaction, there were several specific measures related specifically to improvements in regional activity centers. But what was found in the last version of transaction is that they're not defined in a uniform way across the region. So for example, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor is in fact 5 separate RACs, while there's only a few, say, in Roslyn or Prince William County. So it was biasing things a little bit for the jurisdictions who had not chosen to have things defined as activities. So improvements to the pedestrian, the walk environment in RACs will still be considered, but all improvements to pedestrian and bike environments will be considered under that metric. So you don't not get credit, for example, if you happen to be outside of an RAC. So that we did not update. There was also a request, and there has been some discussion about under accessibility, looking at access to other things besides jobs, right? Our measures and jobs. And we use jobs as a proxy for other things, right? Congregations, agglomerations of jobs tend to happen where there's stuff, right? At shopping malls, at schools, at medical facilities, at the stuff people want to go to, in addition to jobs that people have to go to for work. So we use that jobs as a proxy for a wider range of economic and social opportunities. So we are not changing that for this measure. There was also some discussion around emissions at accounting for non-transportation emissions. That was something we felt we couldn't address in the transportation plan. And couldn't measure with the tools that we have, so we were not making that change. And then we had a discussion about, and I think it was with this committee, about including wait time for transit passengers in the calculation of transit delay. That was also not incorporated for a couple of reasons, one being that wait time is a part of transit travel, and folks know that. But also when we took a look at this, if you increase transit ridership, you are also increasing the wait time of everyone in the region on transit, right? Because there's just more people doing it. And that measure would have perversely discouraged the addition of new transit. We did not want to do that. We will, however, as discussed last time, Frank, be able to report those numbers for interest and also be able to normalize them by the number of trips so that you can see how that's changing, but we're not going to use it as a network-based performance. So those were the comments. Those were the changes. You can see the summary of what that results in on the next slide. And so we've done a couple of things here. So the changes that we just talked about have been represented here. You'll also see that in a couple of these metrics, there's a slight change in how we talk about the performance measure itself, a shift towards are we measuring as opposed to what is the way that we're calculating it, because we found that that was also a little bit confusing for some of the less technical folks. So we wanted to make sure we were consistent from top to bottom on that. And we also have on the far right sort of how each of the performance metrics align with the core values, those 3 core values. So the scales are equity, the hand with the plant is sustainability, and I'm calling her a lady in a hard hat, is safety. So you can see we've actually got a pretty good spread, and we were pleasantly surprised when we discovered that when we rolled them up to the goal level, all 3 core values are represented in all 3 of our goals, which was an accident, but a happy.
No, it's not an accident. We meant to do that.
No, we did not rig this game. It worked out that we did a really good job in putting these together. So if anyone has questions either on the changes we made or on the goals, objectives, and measures themselves, as I say, the goals and objectives themselves have not changed since the last time we spoke. I was proven wrong. The only difference is that the emissions objective has moved from the first goal to the third. So the only changes really are to the performance measures at this point.
Any questions? Open floor. Comments?
That's a good question.
Absolutely.
Just related to the next step. So you mentioned that weighting will not be occurring, or any discussion of weighting won't occur tonight, but that will be next month.
We will start that discussion today.
And the weighting
Right
will
now, we are only looking at, are these measures, objectives, goals, are they good to go as it is? We are not thinking about which one should get higher priority.
Our charge for tonight is to accept, approve these, as far as we've discussed in the past couple.
And so that weighting that we're talking about in the future would be distributed amongst performance measures.
Yes.
Correct.
At that point. Okay.
Correct.
That's what I assumed. I just wanted to.
That's when we get to the same old argument about
Well, at least
congestion and safety.
there's only 10 of them. I think that was my count in previous years, like there were like 20 or more. No.
It's great.
I can live with that. That I can live with.
Yeah.
Do we have a motion to recommend MBTA approval of the transaction goals, objectives, and performance measures? Yeah. Was that a question or a motion? You make the motion that what I just said. Do we have a second? Second. All those in favor, raise hand. Any opposed? All approved. We can move on to the next item, the discussion and information, the online survey, interim findings, your favorite topic over there. Evan.
Yeah, she likes it so much, she delegated to me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Delegate
I
up.
have my name on it, but I can make contact.
Exactly. Yes, so last time when we were here not too long ago, we talked about the focus groups, where we talked with 95 people. This was the full transaction survey where we got over 2,300 responses, so much bigger. sample of opinions. I think you heard the overview in terms of we did this on a MetroQuest platform, which allowed for sort of gamification, meaning there were different questions, but also some exercises in terms of setting preferences. Survey was available in English, Korean, and Spanish. The dates of the survey were August 6th through September 19th. And you can see the distribution by languages. And we did add the note that although we have 65 that filled out the survey in Spanish, 123 people who attended pop-ups received assistance. We had tablets, and they were able to. Someone that helped fill out the survey. It was filled out in English, but those were Spanish speakers. Another point, particularly as we get into results, is that this was not a random sample recruitment. So in other words, this was really us asking people to participated. So just keep that in mind as we look at results. These do not statistically represent the population. When we look at the numbers, we'll talk a little bit about how representative. In terms of how we reach people, there were a whole range of activities. We had a whole promotion. I think we talked about that at the last meeting. We used traceable links, though, it shows a little bit where people, which links they picked, and gave us an idea of how they heard about the survey. So you can see the breakdown there, particularly with some of our social media platforms. You see the pop-up events had a separate link. I guess they went through the main MBT, the transaction website. The top way that people got there. So just to give you a feel for how people heard about the survey. Next. In terms of the survey respondents, and again, I think we mentioned last time, we actually had some responses from outside of the Northern Virginia region. So we had some from Maryland and the district, we had some from south of the region, like the Fredericksburg area, but generally they were, from Northern Virginia, and you can see how it breaks down by this organization of the core of Arlington, Alexandria Falls Church, the inner Fairfax County, Fairfax City, and the outer being Loudoun, Prince William, Manassas City, Manassas Park. See the breakdown, and if we take out the ones that weren't in the region, it's about 43% for that core, 37% for the inner, and 19% outer. So
how does that compare to the population of the region?
Yeah, so we know we are oversampling on the core and undersampling on the outer. So the actual for the core is 16% of the population, and for the outer, 37% of the population. So generally, I think let's keep that in mind when we show totals, but we try to break it out by area to kind of correct for that. So that's our approach to this. Since it's not overall statistically representative, we can take market segments, and then it's more fair. Look at how different market segments.
Can I ask one question? I know they're not in Northern Virginia, but we have impact work traffic from West Virginia. I'm up Route 7. I know all the time they leave their home like 5 a.m.
Yep.
early. But that, and I guess Fredericksburg is outside of the area. We have folks that are just outside, but do impact our traffic.
Yeah, well, one thing we haven't really looked at were those responses we got from outside the region. We're interested to see what we got anything different from those folks. Yeah, I think again, this is just who took the survey, but obviously folks external to the region have a big impact. The demographics, 12% from households with less than $50,000 a year annual income, which is a little low in income. The actual is 17%. In terms of the households with higher incomes above 150,000 a year, we were actually pretty close. We have 42% of the survey and 38% actual. So, and then in terms of race and age, we note here 31% basically minority that completed the survey. The actual number is more like 49%. So we're a little under on minority, and we oversampled on people 65 years or older. We had 19%, the actual number is 11%. So it's how it broke down. I think the encouraging thing was it's a big sample. We can look at some of these individual groups and see their responses and have a good sample to pick from. So we asked a series of questions. The first category were travel characteristics, asking about how folks travel today, and well, it was really how they traveled before the pandemic, how they expect to travel after the pandemic was kind of the questions. And so, from the overall sample, we had a lot of transit users, 31% use transit at least 3 days a week, 14% biked, 28% walked. We also asked questions really about, and what you'll do in terms of change. And works out to about a third said they would either travel more, travel less after the pandemic. As you can see, probably bigger changes for driving. 28% say they'll reduce driving after the pandemic, and transit 21%, but much lower for bike and walking. In other words, people have sort of embraced maybe biking and walking, or at least it's something that they can see themselves doing more of, or at least the same of in the future. Okay, we'll go through these pretty quickly, but we can talk more if there are questions. The next area was sort of influencing factors, so asking what are the things that affect your choice of a mode in terms of making a trip. And so the factors that were most likely to affect mode choice, trip distance was 76% of the people that selected that. Travel time reliability was 60%, traffic congestion 51%, and access to transit, to frequent transit for the top ones. Factors least likely were concerns about crashes and concerns about crime. So the sort of safety and security wasn't a major factor in what mode you choose in any way. Results. Okay, next. We also asked some questions about, what would incentivize you to use transit, and the responses we got. The top responses would be more likely to try transit if the top one was got them to their destination faster, if there was more transit near their home or work, or it was more predictable travel time. So that's definitely time and reliability being top in terms of what would get people to use transit. Only 12% said they were not interested. We had a series of questions around emerging technologies, specifically electric vehicles and automated vehicles. And respondents said they were more likely to consider using an electric vehicle once there's more readily available infrastructure. Which is interesting because that was the discussion at the focus groups too, was having the infrastructure, having a place to charge your car, particularly if you're in an apartment building or somewhere where you may not have access to that, or having it on the road, get on the trip, long trip, will there be a place to recharge? And the price was also a consideration for electric vehicles. For automated vehicles, more likely to use once they had confidence that they were safe. So that's where maybe safety came into play, was when we're talking about AVs. The transportation priority section is a critical part of the survey because this aligns with the objectives that we're talking about, and this feeds into our discussion about weights we're going to have. And so these priorities were essentially where we started with our draft list of objectives, and we asked people to rank first, second, third, and fourth on the different objectives. So the priority most frequently ranked first was more transit, walking, and biking options. Second and third overall were reduced traffic congestion and improved travel time predictability. Yes.
Are those reducing traffic congestion and improving travel time predictability really the same thing?
But we have separate objectives, right? So,
I mean, isn't most unpredictability due to congestion?
yeah, and I guess it's probably, thinking about the total travel time versus, how reliable.
Yeah, I mean, is there a correlation between people how responded to those two? I don't know, it just strikes me as those are really two ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah. But we do.
Necessarily.
They do align with our.
If there's congestion every single day on 66, and I know exactly how much time it's going to take, then that's one thing. If it's different every day, that's very different for me as a driver.
Pretty reliable, you're going to have congestion at that point.
Yeah, but if it's an hour versus half an hour, if I'm planning on half an hour and it's all of a sudden it's an hour, that's a big deal. That's me as a survey taker.
In other places, I have read the same thing. what they call it, reliably congested. It might be congested, but if it's a reliable condition, then I'm fine. I know I had to put 10 minutes extra in my trip. But if it is one day it's 10 minutes, other day it's 30 minutes, that's not going to work.
Suppose people grappled with that as they were using.
I think so.
I would.
I think people think.
I would.
I think the perspective is also really different for transit users, for whom reliability can be on-time performance, but it can also be like a bunch of other things that feel very different. Does the bus come when it says it does? Am I gonna be able to get to work on time? So I think that might also sway how the public thinks about it, but you know, we can't know for sure.
And as we'll see on the next slide, it'll depend on where you live.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is where, yeah, we were saying, really looking a little bit at where people live. So again, we know the survey response from the core and inner jurisdictions selected more transit, walking, and biking as the top priority. When you look at the outer jurisdictions, reduced traffic congestion is the top priority. So there were other objectives where there was less variability. So improved travel time reliability was typically the second one, regardless of whether you're in or outer. Maybe to that point we were just discussing. So, I think this is what I think digging in a little bit by geographic area is quite helpful. Particularly, we're going to do that. We'll talk about weighting as well, because see some of the similar patterns here. All right, next. The last part of the survey was, and this was one of the games, was on allocating resources. Survey response, we're given 10 hypothetical coins. Hopefully they were worth a lot, those coins, because this was to pay for an entire infrastructure program. And so, okay, you have $1 million there, distributed between the 6 project types. And again, just overall rail projects received the most investment, the total coins, followed by roadway construction improvement. And then bus was third in terms of the overall, but we also have that broken down by geographic area. And again, inner jurisdictions, put rail and bus as the first 2 priorities for investment, then roadway improvements. Fairfax, sort of the inner ring of Fairfax County, Fairfax City, was about even between roadway and rail, with buses third. And then if you go to the outer jurisdictions, roadway construction was first, followed by rail second, and bus third. So again, that's kind of what we would expect to see, and that kind of followed what the priorities showed also. Yep. So just to wrap up, top priorities, regardless of area, were more transit, walking, biking, reduced traffic congestion, and improved travel time, predictability or reliability, but order varied by area, geographic area. The focus groups and typically had more often cited reduced traffic congestion, improved reliability, but we should note that we structured those focus groups so that half the focus groups were areas that didn't have transit available to them. So in effect, we may have just been hearing a lot of the same groups from places that were didn't have ready access to high frequency transit. When allocating hypothetical investment dollars in transportation, road and rail were given the highest allocation. People who do not drive frequently place the higher importance on non-roadway investments. And regular drivers, again, that's not too surprising. Regular drivers did allocate the most resources to roadway improvements, but also did allocate significant resources to rail and bus improvements. So I think folks did spread the investment around to cover other modes also. Okay, so that was just a quick overview, and we're going to talk a little more about how this can affect weighting in the next section. Any questions? I guess.
Questions from the committee?
All other results for the fine. Priority or measure.
You hear that?
No, sorry.
How are the results of this to be applied to what we're doing? That's a very good question, because the sample size of this is rather small. I'd hate to put it all on just that.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is just to get a mood of how what people think. It's not, as Tom initially said, we didn't do a statistically structured survey. So this is just to get an idea of what mood is there. And again, it is, as you mentioned, it's slightly skewed because we are over sampling the urban core urban area and other sampling of the suburb. So keep in mind that also when you see this.
Especially when you see rail over bus,
Correct.
considering all the highways. being
When you say
constructed.
rail, we didn't specify whether we are talking about metro or the metro rail. So that is also in the mix. So when you say rail, it doesn't have to be metro improvements. It could be the metro rail improvements, close to the outer suburbs too.
But the question still stands. I think Tom mentioned that there are ways to mitigate the bias in something, so that's fine. But are we going to look at the survey findings and try to change anything, or they are just additional information we can put on the website so that people know whatever we are doing in line with their like opinion or
Yeah, I think it's more of like an opinion survey that we did rather than you making your decision based on that survey. Especially for this committee, that's not what we are expecting. We are expecting you to look at it from your technical expertise knowledge and then where you think you want to put that.
And I would say that one thing the survey tells us is really people's preferences, even though the sample size is small, but I think when you look at respondents from inside the Beltway versus outside the Beltway, that's pretty consistent with what we see and hear. Oftentimes, I can tell you with the Planning and Programming Committee, and I was going to wait for my time on the agenda, but we're doing a work session with the authority next week because, you know, the needs are different depending on where you are in this region. And I think some of the responses are in line with that. But what this means for the transaction update, it's an opinion survey. It helps us gauge where citizens are and think we should be, where they think we are, where, you know, they think we should be. But this is one of several factors that we'll have to, you know, really roll into this transaction update.
This sort of my transition to the next discussion, but given the disparity between the survey results for the inner and the outer areas, is it essential to use exactly the same weighting factors throughout the entire NDTA area, or could you use a different set of weights for
don't think
inner
we
and
want-
outer?
I don't think we want to separate inner and outer.
Yeah, we,
And network level metrics, so no.
Yeah.
and we had that question was asked or comment was made at the PPC meeting. Just cleaning, no one's using the restroom historical. But that question was raised and for consistency purposes, because one of the things, and everyone knows we're grappling with greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And again, depending on where you are in the region, what it really dictates your primary mode. However, the discussion at PPC was no one wanted to be disparaged because of some of the weighting factors. For us, it helps us regarding the modeling purposes and the quantitative evaluation to keep everything consistent. We start, you know, playing around with that a bit. We open ourselves up to probably some things we really didn't need to do. And I always remind the authority, we are multimodal in what, you know, we fund. Land use is a part of this. We don't control land use. We use whatever, and I always do this, Deli always tells me, whatever version COG is on, but we do use that. But, you know, these land use decisions that correspond to a lot of the outputs, these are decisions that the localities have made and COG has adopted. So we're trying to make sure that that's incorporated. One big topic at the PPC meeting was, you know, transit with the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and then what do we do because the needs versus inner versus outer, or looking at inner versus outer could be different.
We're also a regional body. If we start doing inner, outer.
Right.
Regional out of.
Right, and this is why, again, having a work session with the authority, not just looking at, for us, it's important to go well beyond jurisdictional boundaries.
That's the charge on the bill that created the MBTA in the first place.
Have to go beyond jurisdictional boundaries.
Good question, but that comes up quite often. And it's probably going to come up more as Arlington has become more urbanized than it was. Fairfax is getting built out. Then you still have the Louds, Prince Williams, Purcellville.
And the densities are different, you
densities.
know, the inside the Beltway have, you know, they're just more densely populated and they have more robust transit systems. And you heard some of the outers say, I want to be where you are, but it's going to take time.
They have the benefit of having the greenfield, so they can do it the way it's supposed to be done back in the 50s, 60s. As you might remember.
All too much.
Any other questions on this section? We can start dabbling into our weights.
Yes. So this is for the next meeting, we're just introducing it here, but you can probably use your homework to think about this and come up with certain to how you want to go about it for the next week. So this committee, as well as other committees, PCAC and PPC, will get similar same presentation, more or less. And they look at all these survey results or other discussions they have, and then they come up with the weights for each of these measures. And what we as NVIDIA staff, we have done in the past, and we probably will do the same thing, is to average those different opinions and bring together one recommendation as staff recommendation. We will still show each committee's recommendation separately to the authorities, but we'll be taking an average that gives them an idea of where it falls. That will be our recommendation. And we obviously, when we average it out, the decimals, 3 decimals, 4 decimals, however it may go. So we try to keep it simple for the public to understand, and for the analytical side, to keep everything simple, we will round it up to the nearest 5. So 10, 5, 10, 20. And then
I see a problem already. Well, I'll let you finish.
So, and then we have been discussing about core values again and again, and we wanted to see at that point, just for informational purposes, we can add up how much weight each of the core value, different measures add up to, but for each core value. So that is another way we can look at how we are addressing the core values, which core value is more important than. It's not that one is more important than other for us, but when we put those weights, we can see how it falls. And then in November authority meeting, we take your recommendations, other committee recommendations, and the staff recommendations, so they can see all those things, discuss them, come up with the final recommendation. The third bullet there says recommended to NVTA in November. That you are recommending, but authority will take action only in this. Your November cycle of meetings will do the recommendation. Authority will take action. They still have the choice of accepting this recommendation as it is or modify. It's up to the authority. So what we did here is not showing the actual measure per se, but we look at the objectives, because that's how we were doing it at the survey. Where we were showing different objectives, not the measures. So what we didn't call it as objectives at the survey, we called it priorities. So we kind of putting them together here, objectives that we have recommended and you have approved now, and then corresponding priority that was shown in that moment survey, and then the percentage weighted score for each of those priority that we saw on the survey. Again, we split that. The first column shows the regional percentages, and then the next three shows by the sub-region of the core urban area versus the inner suburbs and outer suburbs. Yes.
Is there any way you could, in the materials you would give us when we're studying this over the next month, show what the weights that were used in the prior analysis would be if applied to these? So we have some idea what they would do. Just my impression, I'm looking at this, is when I looked at it, I said, well, I would probably allow about a third of the weights to A, B, and C, a third to D, and a third to E, F, and G. But C could have gone either way. I wasn't sure. But I think that might be a way to approach it, is to, first allow, do an estimate of weights for each group, and then you can allocate the weights within.
One third for each goal, and then
Well,
go down
yeah, well,
approximately.
in this case, I looked at it and I said, well, A, B, and C would be about a third, D would be about a third, E, F, and G would be about a third.
So if you look at it, I put a thicker border there that corresponds to each goal. So A and B is first goal, mobility goal. C and D is the accessibility goal. E, F, and G is the
Almost at third.
Yeah, and that would sort of correspond to the survey, and that doesn't mean they're right, it's just one way to do it. It's a starting point.
I just remind everybody that MBTA was created by HB 599, and those things are outlined as reduce congestion, improve travel time, improve access to jobs.
That's the congestion mitigation.
And that was the guiding principle of the whole process here, was reduce congestion and delay,
That is
Which-
the law.
which improves travel time and delay and improves access to jobs. But the number one thing is to reduce congestion. I'm concerned if we give too much weight to, not that transit walking and biking is not important, I don't mean to say that, take it as it's meant, not as it sounds, but to put more weight on transit gives the interjurisdictions a more oomph than Parcel Hills or the Round Hills or the Western Prince Williams that are also part of the region. That's my soapbox statement for today.
Not necessarily.
Well, I would just say, like Randy says, the law requires the authority to give priority to the projects that have the greatest level of congestion reduction relative to cost. So that's why in the past, we've always had the higher weight for the performance measures that are directly related to congestion reduction. So in the event we're challenged in court, we can show that we did give priority to congestion reduction. But that doesn't mean the other things are not important. And I will even say for the smart scale process, for smart scale for Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia, they too, the Commonwealth has to give a higher weight for congestion reduction. That's also in the law.
Any other comments? I said my piece for today. We'll reconvene this next time when I see the weights.
Are you going to give us any more information that we can look at and consider before the next meeting? So that, maybe we can even respond, since the meeting is, I think, 6 weeks away because of the delay.
yes.
Maybe we could even respond in part. And you could sort of start to assemble some of the results before we actually sit down as a group.
So we can't have you meeting via email. That's the only thing. So we have to be careful of having stuff collated electronically.
For quick point.
Okay. But anything you can give us in advance. then
Yeah, we can
have a
definitely
reference.
get, what's that, the previous weights that we
Yes,
used
that
and the
we can
performance
find out.
measures as well.
The previous weeks, I think you'll find in one of your older packets. If you happen to have those at home.
We can put this
Maybe.
together and send it out again.
Not that we can't send them again, but if you're anxious for homework.
Yeah, we can do that. And so, want to remind you, because the next meeting, it's in the packet, next meeting we pushed out
November 27th.
for 5 days, and that's, the reason is because the authority meeting is pushed 1 week
Yeah.
down the line. Because
Yeah.
of that, we probably need to wait until, we probably need to wait until the authority meeting is over to send you the next full packet. Because though you have already recommended a set of goals, objectives and measures, authority might change it. And we will know only on operating.
Even though from, in, the PPC is only 5 of 17 authority members, I think the performance measures, I think we are in an okay place, but again, we have to get to the full authority. It's the weighting that's probably going to garner more discussion. And as Sri was noting, the November authority meeting was pushed back a week because Veterans Day falls on the second Thursday of the month, which is usually when we meet, so that's a holiday. So that's why the schedules have shifted a bit. And I can call it electronically if you like.
Or the Monday after, or the Monday before
After.
The least of that.
next. Monday before, yeah, 27th. Right, our next meeting, it's on the bottom of the agenda.
Oh, okay. November 26th.
I'm sure Sri will send out the meeting.
Yes.
As well.
That's all I have, Alexis, Monica.
You're up.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair. I will be brief. I believe you are planning to attend the November authority
I am.
meeting. I asked Randy to attend that meeting because it will be good for the authority to hear directly from the TAC chair, Mayor Colbert, who's the chair of the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee. She is going to come to the December authority meeting, but I think it's important for them to hear directly from you all. We tell them, and Randy's name is on the staff report, Linda Colbert's name is on staff report or committee reports, but we do want that interaction. As you may be aware, we had a call for projects that closed on October 1st, and it's for the FY 22 to 27 6-year program. It's the last 6-year program that will be done on the current transaction. So once we get this one adopted, we anticipate during the next 6-year program on the one we're working on now. A lot of requests, 1.3 billion in requests, but we're still the staff going through the QA/QC. But like I told the authority last week, the one thing I could tell them for certain right now, we don't have $1.3 billion. That's the one thing I do know. So we are undergoing some QA/QC analysis. We are waiting for some of the revenue forecasts that are supposed to come out from the Commonwealth in December, as we try to formulate what we think the number is that we'll have available to populate the 6-year program. Because remember, we're only doing the last 2 years, fiscal years 26 and 27. So that's where we are. And we're working on, the authority's working on our legislative program. Our top priority is to get the remaining $38.5 million of diverted revenues restored to the authority. 102 million was diverted from the authority to WMATA. We've received a lot of it back, but 38.5 million is the outstanding balance.
That was a very dark day. Those who weren't here, both Monica and Sri were.
Well, we were doing our first 6-year program, so it was, the authority was saying, how much do we have? I don't know. I was like, I really just don't know. So.
Not a good day. Hopefully that gets back. Any other comments from the committee? Motion to adjourn, please. Motion made, seconded there. And 59 minutes, look at that. We're done.
Look at this, I'm sure I have not.